How can the existence and presence of God be proven to an individual? Let's highlight the phrase "to an individual" because, as we discussed earlier, the existence of God cannot be proven in the same universal empirical way we prove physical or scientific facts. The path to knowing God is deeply personal, rooted in reason, awareness, and inner insight. For those who genuinely seek it, this path is filled with powerful and undeniable signs. In this segment, we'll explore some of those signs. We begin with a foundational, rational principle. Being can never come from non-being. Only something that exists can give rise to something else that exists. Therefore, everything we observe or experience must have a source, something that brought it into being. We may not perceive this source with our senses, but through reason, we can be certain that it must exist. So the journey of discovering God begins inward. Every conscious human being knows one thing with absolute certainty: I exist. And since existence cannot come from non-existence, there must be a greater being who granted us this existence. This realization can open a profound doorway to knowing the divine. Now, it's important to clarify, when we speak of our existence, we are not referring to our physical body or its worldly attributes. These are just external reflections of something deeper. We are speaking of the inner self, the part of us that thinks, chooses, feels, and is aware. This non-physical dimension is the seat of our consciousness, and it's from this inward place that we perceive and interpret the outer world. And it is here, in this sacred space within, that the path to understanding God begins. Now please consider this carefully. Isn't it true that within each of us, we find traces of qualities like power, awareness, love, beauty, justice, creativity, kindness, abundance, or even a longing for immortality? If we pause and reflect, we see that we all carry these qualities to varying degrees. And because we know that something cannot arise from nothing, we arrived at a simple yet profound conclusion. There must be a source for all of these elevated traits, a source that possesses them infinitely and perfectly, and we call that source God. Up to this point, we've used a solid rational principle to show that the presence of these higher qualities within us points to a greater source, a creator. But now comes an important and very natural question. If we as human beings also possess traits like anger, fear, hatred, and violence, then by the same logic, shouldn't there be a source for those too? Do negative traits also require a creator? Does that mean there are two gods, one of good and one of evil? Or one God who is both good and evil? Or maybe no God at all? To address this, let's dive into a core philosophical insight. Consider light and darkness. Do both have independent existence? No. Light has objective, measurable existence, but darkness is not something in itself. It is simply the absence of light. The same is true for heat and cold. Cold isn't a positive force. It is just the lack of heat. And as soon as heat is introduced, cold vanishes instantly. Likewise, traits like fear, hatred, and injustice are not independent forces. They are distortions or absences of higher virtues, like faith, love, and justice. What we call violence doesn't arise from its own unique source. It is simply what happens when kindness is missing. Fear emerges not because it has a separate origin, but because faith is absent. And we can extend this idea to many so-called negative experiences. In essence, evil cannot have a true source because it lacks independent being. What we perceive as evil is merely the absence or distance from good. And here's another important insight. Evil, by nature, is self-destructive. It cannot persist as a unified force because it consumes itself. Take the example of certain bacteria. When their population grows beyond the limits, they begin to produce antibiotics and toxic byproducts. These substances, originally meant to outcompete others, end up destroying their own colony. In the same way, if evil were to accumulate in one place, it would eventually destroy itself. So philosophically, evil cannot have a sustaining, independent source. It depends entirely on the lack or absence of good. Now, this leads to another profound question. If God, the source of absolute goodness, created us, why do these negative traits appear in human beings? Shouldn't perfectly good Creator have made us all perfectly good as well? The answer lies in our closeness or distance from that Creator. Take power as an example. We all have some power, and we naturally seek more of it. God is the infinite source of power. So the closer we move toward God, the more empowered we become. But that journey requires that we also grow in love, awareness, creativity, kindness, and others, because these are all facets of God's nature. One cannot move closer to the divine by developing only one trait while ignoring the rest. If a person seeks power alone, without growing those other divine attributes, they step out of alignment with the divine balance. This misalignment leads them to lie, manipulate, or use violence in pursuit of power. And that is what we call evil. Not a separate force, but the absence of wholeness, of harmony, of goodness. In short, negative traits appear when someone pursues one divine quality while neglecting the others. This imbalance gives rise to the shadows we experience as vice or evil. And finally, let's remember, our very purpose in this life is to grow and elevate ourselves to reach a higher state of being through our own free will. It was never intended for God to create us immune to all faults. If He had, then striving for higher states would have no meaning or value. This will be explored more in our episode on the secret of human creation. To conclude, true self-knowledge always leads to knowledge of God. When a person deeply reflects on their own divine qualities, they inevitably sense the presence of a source, an infinite being behind them all. And from that moment on, they begin to see both their own existence and the entire universe as nothing less than a reflection of the divine.
The content you just listened to is part of the teachings of Sayyid Said Tagavi-Zadeh in the field of theology and the pursuit of true happiness. These teachings are interconnected, so many of the unclear points will become clearer in the upcoming episodes. For this reason, it is important to follow the series from the beginning in order to fully benefit from its inner value. Additionally, there will be separate programs dedicated to answering frequently asked questions. Until the next episode, goodbye and may God be with you.